All right, well, let's get started. Let's kick off with our first topic of choice, the Playdate.
The Playdate. Tell me about the Playdate, Justin.
No, tell me about the. No, okay, I'll tell you about the Playdate. I'll tell you all about it.
Give me all the dirt.
Um,
The dirt.
yeah, so I mean, the high level information you need to know about the Playdate is it is a handheld console in the style of like Game Boy almost. I'd say it's a super simplified
Yeah.
handheld gaming experience. Published by the company, or not published by the company, but developed and released by the company Panic, which is a publisher of such indie darlings as Untitled Goose Game, and they were also publishers of Firewatch. They developed a couple apps too that weren't in the game space, like FTP clients, stuff like that, for mobile devices. But they went on to publishing games and now producing and manufacturing their own little handheld console. And they're working with Swedish company Teenage Engineering, which is the people who are doing the product development with them. So they have this brand new console. It's weird in a lot of ways. I
Mm-hmm.
think probably the strangest part about the whole thing is its business model, which we'll go into detail about. But let's first go over the like basic details of it. Eric, pre-orders opened on July 29th. How did it do?
It did exceedingly well. It sold out in 20 minutes. But I mean, to be fair, they only had 22,000 in stock, like in their
Available
initial
units.
available units. Yeah,
Yeah.
their stock. So with the 22,000, 20-minute sellout is pretty good. You do the math on that. They're about 179 bucks a piece. And that works out to be roughly 4 million. So $4 million in income in 20 minutes is a pretty good rate.
I take it.
Like that did pretty well. Um, for a company that has been just until recently mainly making Mac OS software for Apple's Mac operating system. To be fair, they had a lot of marketing behind them. There was a lot of energy that they'd announced this is what we're building, and they got a lot of interest from indie developers and from players to say, "Oh boy, this is actually something that looks like a fun little cheap device."
Cheap in the sense that it's not as expensive as a Switch.
Right? Yeah, for a handheld, like all or any phone these days, that's not locked into a 2-year plan or anything.
Yeah. So some other interesting details about this. Their hybrid like business model is new. I'd say this is something that's
Yeah.
not been tried out, and I'm not entirely sure how it works exactly because I think some of the details about how it extends is still vague. But the basic tenets of their business is that you drop the $179 for the console itself. You do not buy games. You subscribe to games. And they have like these seasons of 24 games released twice a week. So basically, you get two new games per week, 24 games per year, and you get those as part of the package. I know with people who are purchasing the $179 version, get that 1 year worth of games.
Yep.
What happens beyond this like year, unclear. It seems like they plan to roll them out every 2 weeks, no matter what. And your subscription starts at the time you start. So if you pick up the console, whatever, 6 months from now, you start getting games trickled out to you, starting with that season. So you get 24 games, or it works something like that. It's a very weird concept that we just haven't really experienced in games yet. But they're supposed to detail it further about like what you can expect beyond the first year or the first season of games. Can you tell us a bit about the games that they are getting? Because this is the cool part.
Yeah, the only one that I've really seen, and this has been something I've kind of followed for a while, they like to showcase it a lot, is the one by Keita Takahashi. Well, where Keita Takahashi is the lead designer. For those who don't know Keita Takahashi, he is the designer of uh, Katamari Damashi And there's another game that there's like a weird. He's got a weird design aesthetic.
Nobi
Do you
Nobi
remember
Boy
Nobi Boy? That's it.
and
Yeah,
Watam.
and Watam. Yeah. This game that he's working on for the Playdate is one where you're a little robot and you use the crank, and then that plays the game forward. And it's on a mostly preset kind of um, timeline. The fun part about it is that when you, depending on how fast you turn the crank, the game itself will play it that the speed matching the speed at which you're uh, turning the crank. So if you turn it really slowly, all the sound gets really slowed and stretched out, and the animations slow down. The interesting thing to me is that use of the crank, right, to play with game time itself and how things advance.
Plus, they're like, I mean, they've been around enough, and given that they've been publishers of some of the biggest indie titles, or like at least critically acclaimed indie titles, they have some support from some of the larger indie developers, including Lucas Pope. So he's going to be developing a game for it, and there's a bunch of others that have signed on that um, are going to be making games within the first season. I have a feeling they're going to be exclusive ways to play these games. Like there's not going to be another way of getting a hold of these because they're built specifically for this hardware. The hardware
Yeah.
itself is, while probably really easy to emulate, is not. Um, there's no other way to play it. It's like these aren't built for, the PlayStation 4 or whatever.
You mentioned Lucas Pope. Can you, for those who don't know the name by, what is Lucas Pope known for?
I mean, he's an indie developer. I don't know if he's like he's the type that publishes, like, he develops the entire game by himself, but
Yep.
he's responsible for Papers, Please, which is one of the earlier indie games that really made like a big impact, showing that the gamification, or not the gamification, but giving games a lot more depth in the story that they're telling. And Papers, Please is a game where you're like a bureaucrat, um, having people cross the border, and you having to make a determination about their the quality of the person to let them in or reject them.
It puts you in some really in rough situations. Definitely go play it if you haven't. It is incredible. And by rough situations, I mean things like there is a woman who is trying to get across the border to reunite with her. She has 2 kids with her. She's trying to reunite with her husband, and you have to make the call of about whether or not she is somehow some rebel in disguise, or if she is like a legit person who should be let through. His next game was Return of Obra Dinn. That's the thing I'm pretty sure he did most recently. Okay, great. So the specs of the device. Let's dive into that. It's actually pretty interesting. They're all available on the Play.date website, but we'll cover them here really quickly. It has a 180 megahertz Cortex M7, which is it's a pretty the Cortex ARM processor is pretty recent. And
But
it has
I will
another
say it runs at
coprocessor, right?
180 megahertz, like extremely like limited processor, super lightweight, super energy efficient.
0.18 gigahertz. It has an 80 megahertz
Coprocessor, basically, but it's a comms processor, basically. Like in its function, it handles the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi protocols.
Yep. And those Bluetooth and Wi-Fi protocols include BG and N, 802.11 BG and N. Why you need the N, I don't know, because you're probably going to overwhelm its data speed very quickly, or its data capacity, because it has memory for 4 gigabytes of storage. It has Bluetooth 4.2. It does have a USB-C input. On the face of it, it has a D-pad and an A and a B button, and then it's got that crank on the side.
Crank.
Yep. And the fun part is that it has a 400 by 240 pixel 1-bit display, which means it's literally just black and white. And the display is e-ink, running at 30 to 50 hertz, so it doesn't have any with no ghosting. So it just updates very quickly.
Yeah, and apparently the effect from people who play the game is like it presents extremely nicely. I mean, yeah, it's a black and white display, but the the visual presentation is this super smooth looking, and depending on how you animate, like in the case of um, uh, uh, Keita Takahashi's game, like you have really smooth animation. So even though it's looks old school, it performs visually much better than you probably remember on like the original Game Boy screen. But it does
Have I
require that you have a front lighting to see it. Like you're back to the point where you actually have to have a light on the screen in order to see it. No, I mean the whole thing's bizarre, but it's charming, right? Like it's got like
it's
that
very charming.
old school charm, and charming enough that people are going, yeah, even for this quality of handheld experience, I'm willing to spend $180 to get it, which
Yeah.
I still think is pretty expensive for what it's presenting. But like, I don't know. We can talk about this a bit later, but it's like, what's the value of a game, and is it the hardware that's more valuable, or the game itself?
Yeah.
Um, which I think is kind of what they're questioning here by with a subscription model. But another interesting feature about it is that it is open, right? There's an available dev kit that for
Yeah.
this, and it takes regular programming language. So anybody who wants to toy around with developing on like with these sort of constraints to see what type of games you make, it's available to do so. And I would assume that there's some sort of process to develop a game, submit it to Panic for their publishing, and then them doing some sort of profit share with you. Let's get into like some more pondering of what this thing actually means for the industry and what it means about how something like this can exist. What are the things that are most interesting to you about hardware, business model, whatever? What are the things that are interest you the most about Playdate?
I think it's the scope. I think it there's the fact that it's so limited, and that they're doing a lot. So there's two pieces of this. One is the scope, and one is the backing of the company Panic themselves. Um, and I'll go over the scope first. Scope to me is, as a developer, when you deal with games, making games, you are trying to get as much out of the hardware as you can. With modern consoles and modern technology, there is a lot that those devices can do, that the hardware can do. And it takes an immeasurable amount of software to be working in the correct way and enough artists to really make it work as well as it does and to look as good as it does. In this case, you're forced as a developer to do something um, minimal, and in that in minimalness, you frequently can find creativity and creative ways to get around restrictions. And I think to me, that's a lot of where this stuff is. The interesting part of this comes. The addition of that little crank is interesting, but it is a novel experience to be able to like just rotate the side. So there's a few interesting things there, and what developers will do with it is piquing my developer and gamer interest. On the Panic side, Panic is a company that um, I am familiar with from the Mac software days, where there were frequent times when I would end up finding myself on their website, looking at their documentation, looking at their application offerings, and it was very clear that they had a very interesting attention to detail, where everything was user focused. They wanted their apps to be as usable and eminently discoverable as possible, to make things as simple as they needed to be, but no more, and provide users with the features that they wanted to make it a joy to use the technology. To me, this is we went from the ground up and built this thing, and we put our name and our brand and ourselves behind it. And there is something there for me. How about you, Justin? What do you think about it?
I mean, I think there is a lot to that, like forcing limitations on the creator to force a new type of creativity.
Yeah.
which had been a staple to console game development and I mean even PC game development for quite some time, where there's like
Yeah.
severe limitations on what you could do, color palette, how many sprites you could get in a on a sprite sheet to make up the entire game, like
Yeah.
how much you could load into RAM, and so it required like a lot of creative problem solving that you don't really get with games today. As you're saying, it's all about how much can we optimize, and really the the biggest limitations to game development today are mostly optimizing to get the frame rate or whatever it is that you're looking for as a target. Um,
Yeah.
so this is bringing back to like that creative sort of development of the days before, where you couldn't just make whatever your wildest imagination could think of. Now it's a lot about creating based off of the limitations you're set with, and making use of the novelty of the hardware itself. Why do you think now is the time a game console like this can succeed?
I think a lot of it has to do with us, like you and me, and the upper half of the millennial generation. Um, in that we are now hitting that point where we have, well, in theory, some expendable cash, and are definitely feeling nostalgia for childhood and looking back on stuff. And it is not at all a coincidence that the thing looks like a miniaturized Game Boy. Like it's kind of halfway between original Game Boy and Game Boy Advance, right? Kind of the squatness of it versus the tallness, and the screen screams original Game Boy. Like for me looking at that, I'm like, oh, that is charm. There's there, like I associate that visual of those like big pixels, big dark pixels, with um having a lot of fun with my original Game Boy in childhood. And now it's like a callback to carefree times where we didn't have that what's it called, responsibility.
Yeah, I also think there's something to be said for like having like simplified experiences. Because the
Yeah.
Switch is great as a handheld console, but the majority of games that you invest in on that are these sort of long, sprawling adventures that require a lot of time and focus. So I think this is sort of maybe a whole rebuke to the way the game industry has gone, and it's pushing back at saying, no, this is the only thing that we do, and the intent is to play high quality games that are meant for mobile usage.